Great. Good morning, everyone. Today's text, well, we're going to end up in Hebrews 4, 14 through 5, 7. But we're going to start out with a couple of verses we heard last week. In fact, we're going to park there today. Hebrews 3, 12 through 13. These verses, Hebrews 3, 12 through 13, begin some counseling that Hebrews had for the Christians they were writing to, and that counseling session, I'm going to call it that, extends into our reading for today that we heard. And that's going to be the big idea for today, wise counsel. We're going to talk about who needs counseling, not necessarily professional counseling, but who needs counseling, why we need it, how often we need it, and where to find it. So Hebrews, of course, I remind you of this every week, but just to bring this fresh to your mind, was written to a struggling church. Life was so hard for these Christians that they were tired, right? And they were restless, and they were discouraged, and they were about to give up and just go back out into the world. In fact, some apparently had already done that. And there were others who were sitting there that, let's kind of imagine this church gathered on Sunday morning, right? Like we are. And there were some of them sitting there thinking, I don't think I'm coming back next week. So they were struggling, and some of them were anxious, and some of them were suffering. But even so, one of the things about Hebrews is that they did not tone down their message or water down their message. When it came time to kind of hold the people's feet to the fire, they did. So here's what Hebrews told them. Take care, brothers and sisters, lest there be in any of you an evil, unbelieving heart. John Calvin translated that as a depraved heart of unbelief, or a wicked heart of unbelief. An evil, unbelieving heart, leading you to fall away from the living God. I want to talk about something here for a second that this verse kind of highlights. How many of you know, like you see this, you hear this in the culture and in maybe the media you watch, especially if you're like watching, Disney movies or Lifetime movies or Hallmark movies, your friends might tell you that. How many of you have been told and given advice, given counsel to just follow your heart? You ever been told that? According to this passage, it is not safe to just follow your heart. Your heart can lead you away from God, right? Because your heart can be unbelieving, your heart can be sinful. So instead of just following your heart, that's right up there with the advice, just be yourself. Like, my best version of being myself was going to send me to hell. Like, there is a you that God created you to be, and we need to be striving to grow into that. But if you are dysfunctional and abusive, and you're a bully, you do not just need to be yourself. You need to be sanctified. And it's the same thing with kind of following your heart. Your heart needs to be transformed. Your heart needs to be made holy. So instead of just following your heart, Hebrews says, but exhort one another every day, as long as it is called today, that none of you may be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. I want to talk about this word exhort, right? That's not a word we use very often, right? Exhort. Now, your Bibles might say, translated as encourage one another every day. I've seen help one another. I've seen warn one another. And of course, encourage and warn sound like very different words, but here's the deal with that. The Greek word back of that is this word that's parakaleo. And here's the mental picture that parakaleo is supposed to draw for you. It's someone who comes alongside, like comes beside you, and maybe they even kind of put their arm around you and kind of take you aside and draw you into their confidence. And they, like, hey, what's going on, right? Like, can we talk about this? You got something going on? And And so they listen to you, right? Like they really listen to you. They speak words that comfort you. They give you pep talks, but they're going to confront you, right? And they're going to challenge you, and they're going to warn you when you're going astray. And so that word exhort right there is the closest word that we have in our Bibles to what we would call counseling, right? And so when you read that, read it, counsel one another. Counsel one another. Now these verses come at the end of a paragraph that begins in verse 7 of chapter 3. And I'm going to read some of this to you, and I want you to notice what it says about the dangers, because it's going to also be talking about this of just following your heart wherever it leads you. Therefore, as the Holy Spirit says, today if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion on the day of testing in the wilderness, where your fathers put me to test and saw my works for 40 years. Therefore I was provoked with that generation and said, they always go astray in their heart. They have not known my ways. Right? So there's just two kind of heart issues, right? Hardening your heart when you hear the voice of the Lord. So kind of say, I'm going to steel up against that. And then your heart leading you astray. And those two things are very connected. There's an Old Testament story that Hebrews had in mind. And if you grew up in Sunday school, you might know it. I'm going to give you a refresher. But, right, Israel, right, when they were journeying in the wilderness between Egypt and Canaan, between Egypt and the Promised Land. Now, God had acted powerfully, right? He sent the 10 plagues on Egypt, right? And then when they were walking out, he opened the sea, right, for the Israelites to walk through, and then he closed it back up on Egypt's army. And he had acted powerfully, mightily, to rescue the Israelites from slavery. And now he's bringing his plan, right, is to bring these former slaves now to this home that he's promised them. Why? So they can rest. We talked about that last week. This journey through the wilderness, incidentally, should have taken 2 weeks or less. How long did they end up wandering in the wilderness? 40 years. Why? Because unbelief entered their hearts there in the wilderness. And they forgot everything that God had done for them. And they started asking among themselves. You read this in Exodus 17, verse 7. They started asking, is the Lord really among us? And then they panicked. They were having a hard time getting water. They're in the wilderness. They were having a hard time getting food. So where will we get water? Where we're going to eat? And then when God fed them, right? Remember he sent the manna for them to eat? They complained about it. This food sucks, God. Give us something better. At least in Egypt, we had, fish and onions and meat and stuff we could eat. You were like getting worked to death and beaten mercilessly every day, but yeah. Yes, our mind does that, This is why some people will go back into situations where they are being abused, because there's something about our mind that remembers the comfort and the stability, right? And the freedom of being away from that. It's just hard because at least there was a level of structure, right? And this is what's going on with the Israelites. It's really sad. And then, you know what? But beyond that, more than one occasion, they just said, we're going to tell Moses to kick rocks. And we're gonna get a new leader, and we're gonna let that leader take us back to Egypt. Like, what are you gonna do? Like, go to Egypt and ask for your old job back? I mean, right? And then they started accusing God. It's here in Exodus 17 again, and this is only just like a few days after the Red Sea crossing. That's what's so ridiculous about this. They started accusing God, saying, "No, Lord, you just brought us out into this desert so you can kill us here. You brought us out here to let us die." And here's ultimately God's response to that. I mean, it's not, all those episodes happened, and there was more and more faithlessness. And God finally said, look, If that's the kind of God that you think I am, right, that I rescued you from slavery just so I could bring you out here to die, then guess what? Okay, that's just become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Ain't none of y'all from that generation getting into the promised land. The overwhelming majority, right, of people who were adults when the Exodus happened, that generation, they died from old age, still in the wilderness, without ever experiencing the rest that God had prepared for them. Now, Hebrews used that story during their counseling session, because it's really it's one way of looking at Hebrews, with those struggling Christians, and to basically say, don't be like them. Don't be like them. Don't be like them and give up. Like nothing good is going to come from that. Instead, exhort or counsel one another every day, as long as it is called a day, right? As long as God is giving you a day to be alive, right? As long as He is still patient and Christ has not returned yet, counsel one another every day, that none of you may be hardened, your hearts hardened, right? Like the people in the wilderness, by the deceitfulness of sin. Hebrews 3, 12 and 13 is really all about wise, godly counseling. So remember I said that today's all about wise counsel, and I asked these kind of 4 questions, right? Like, according to these verses, who needs counseling? All of us. Sometimes, right? Why do we need it? To keep our hearts from being hardened by sin and unbelief, right? So that we don't fall away from the living God. How often do we need it? According to this verse, every day. I would say at least routinely or regularly, right? And where do we get it? Now, this is where things get complicated, right? Because we get it from each other. Wow, okay. Here's where things get complicated. And here's why I can't let the conversation stop here and just let us go to Golden Corral or wherever. Because I haven't said really anything about Jesus yet. So if I hadn't said anything about Jesus, I hadn't proclaimed the gospel, I hadn't done my job. I haven't really said anything about us. And surely we need more, like if we're going out in the world, we need more than a list of rules about counseling. After all, the Israelites that ended up dropping dead in the wilderness, they had a plenty good enough list of rules. They had 10 of them that pretty much covered not just counseling, but all the bases of life, right? And yet, what happened? They still got stuck in the wilderness. Here's what Hebrews, one of those Christians back then to understand, and what God wants us to understand now. Spiritually, emotionally, psychologically speaking, our life in this world is like traveling through the wilderness. That was true for the Israelites way back when. It was true for the Christians that Hebrews counseled, 2,000 years ago, and it's definitely still true for us today. Life in this world is a journey through a wilderness. Now let me paint you a picture of what a Bible person would have meant when they talked about a wilderness, because when we think of the term wilderness now, right, a lot of us might think of a place like this. It's wild. This is the Alaskan wilderness. It's wild. It's pristine, right? You might could even imagine going there so you could relax and get away from people for a while, right? And all the sounds But for people in the biblical world, a wilderness meant something more like this. It's a desert. It's a dry, dangerous, unforgiving land. It's a barren wasteland. Water and food are extremely scarce, and you're competing with wild animals for every scrap that you get. Bandits, robbers like to hang out in the wilderness, man. So there's also danger on that level. And then the second you get weak or you get sick or you get hurt, and you fall down in the wilderness, those animals that you've been fighting for scraps with, you're going to be their food. Those animals are going to eat you. So Hebrews is saying, this is what our world is like. Our life in the world is like. You can't give up because it's hard, because it's the wilderness. It's not supposed to be easy. And if Hebrews is correct, and I believe Hebrews is correct, or I wouldn't be preaching about this, if life in this world really is a journey through the wilderness, there's a couple of things that as Christians, we just have to accept. Like, I can't soft pedal this to you. You just have to accept this. First, you will never find true fulfillment here, in this life and in this world. And second, sometimes it will be very hard to see God at work here. First, we're not going to find fulfillment in the wilderness. The wilderness is not a place where you want to settle. Like, I know there's like 500 people or so who live in Death Valley. I don't know what's wrong with them, but they do. But most of us, right, it is not a place where we want to settle. I mean, you can kind of survive in the wilderness, but you can't really, like, live there, right? Life in this world is a lot like that, too. You will never be able to feed the deepest needs of your heart or satisfy the thirst of your soul with the things that this world has to offer. You know, that old gospel song we sang growing up, "Wait, this world is not my home, I'm just a passing through. My treasures are laid up somewhere beyond the blue." Right? Now, if we sing that song, because here's the thing, man, this song got on my nerves for years, because I thought, man, I don't have time to go through my issues with it right now. Here's what I will say, because it is a cool song, all right? It's like got a great catchy melody. If we sing this song with understanding, what it's trying to teach us is that this world is a wilderness, and it's a barren wasteland, and it's a place that we just have to journey through so we can get home. Now, here's the point. I don't want you to misunderstand. This world is not my home. When you sing that, that doesn't mean that this world with grass and flowers, it's not talking about that, or mountains and rivers and great baked foods and rich fine wine and nights with people you love right around the fire, true love, deep friendships. It's not talking about that world. See, that world that's all part of God's intention for our creation. That's all being redeemed, according to Scripture. It's going to be waiting for us in the city of God when we arrive. Right? Dancing and hugs and all that stuff. That's going to be part of it. It's going to be even better than it is now, because you have eternity to explore and to enjoy. You don't have to worry about being parted or dying or anything. But what this song is saying when it says this world is not my home, it's talking about the world where it's cutthroat and competitive and cruel, right? Just like in the wilderness, you got to fight with the wild animals and the jackals and the hyenas and stuff to every scrap you get. It's this world of disease and disorder and of death and decay, this world of abuse and violence, this world of shame and fear, this world of poverty and hunger, this world of lies and corruption and pollution, right? It's talking about that world. That world is not our home, because that is not the world that God intended. And here's the point. We can never have the deepest needs and desires and longings of our spirits fulfilled in this wilderness. Because even those good and beautiful things that I talked about earlier, right? You know, the beauty of the created world and of marriage and family and church. Even those good and beautiful things, we see this all the time, right? They are all eventually distorted or corrupted or destroyed by the evil, ugly things that are lurking in the wilderness. I mean, you would better not look to satisfy your spiritual hunger through your marriage, your family, through your job or your hobbies, or I don't know, through like self-improvement or any of that. Because none of those are going to last forever. Like, think about this. Everything you know, everyone you know. I know this is real cheerful, but it's the truth. I'm saying you just have to accept this. And we try not to, but it's the truth. Everything you know, everyone you know, is dying and scattering and turning to dust. And that includes you. It includes me. We all come into the world with an expiration date on us. Even so, it's almost like we forget that because it's so easy for us to invest all of our attention on those things that cannot ultimately satisfy us because they are not ultimate. God alone is ultimate. Why do we do it? Here's why. Here's why I think that we end up for second and third tier joys and we're trying to satisfy our hearts. It's that second reason. In this wilderness of life in this world, it is often very difficult to see God at work. Now let's think about the Israelites, right? Again, when they were in Egypt, they saw God at work. Right? Like, they saw the Nile River turn to blood and darkness cover the land and the firstborn sons dying. I mean, you kind of can't miss that. And they saw, right, as they were leaving, they saw God opening the sea, right, for them to cross through. And when they finally got to Canaan, right, they had this land that was flowing with milk and honey, so they could see God's providence and blessings there in the land. It wasn't like that in the wilderness, though. In the wilderness, the most they saw of God was kind of a cloud above them. And let's face it, we can explain away a cloud, right? Miracles were scarce. The big impressive miracles. For some reason, they the manna, that wasn't the miracle they wanted. The point is, God was not often working in ways that they could perceive with their senses, but our senses are always dulled and clouded by us being finite and by our sin. Our sinfulness always kind of puts blinders on what we can see. They couldn't see what God was doing, and because they couldn't see what God was doing, that's why they just assumed that what? He had just abandoned them there. He had just left them there to rot. And that's why they hardened their hearts. They got stubborn. They got cynical. They began to complain. They began to treat God and Moses with contempt. Now that happens to us too. And when I say us, a lot of times I'm just talking about Christians in general. No, we're going to talk about us for a little bit. You know where I see it especially among us, and this is, think about this. When we go to Sierra Bible Camp, we are out there in God's good creation, right? And we are seeing God's hand moving, right? Hardened hearts are being softened. We feel the Spirit stirring. Prayers are being answered every day. Relationships form and reform, right? And it's every day. Every day you've seen some kind of miracle going on. And then we come back down from the mountain. We come back here to the valley. We come back down to the wilderness. And we're like, where's God? It wears off. Like, you know how like eventually like when Moses would be with God and he would come down and he had the glory like kind of glowing from him and then it would start to fade, right? Does that with us too. And where's God? Where's the miracles we were seeing on the daily up there? And why are my prayers bouncing off the ceiling now? I know a lot of you young people have experienced that, and I think a lot of us grown-up people have experienced that too. Here's what you need to understand. life here in the valley, life here in the wilderness, the stuff up there on the mountain is not the norm of anyone's Christian life. Life here in the valley, life here in the wilderness is the norm. And it was like that even in the Bible. It's not like everybody in the Bible just got a morning, personal morning wake-up call from God saying, "Good morning, it's God giving you your wake-up call." And then saw like 3 miracles before breakfast every day. If that's how you think it worked back then, man, that's not... Think about this. Before God came and got them out of Egypt, it had been hundreds of years since the Israelites heard anything from God. Events like the 10 plagues, the Exodus, taking the promised land, like the Bible slows down to show us those events in detail, but they were very rare kind of things. That's why they were so special. They were exceedingly rare. In fact, the norm in our lives, here's the problem, because people want to chase after the big thing. And you can't have your whole life. In fact, the one time that Jesus' disciples wanted to do that, right? Remember, they were on the Mount of Transfiguration because they'd experienced God there. And they wanted to park there and, hey, man, we're just going to live here. And God's like, nope. Right? Y'all listen to Jesus. He's going back down that mountain. You go with him. You don't get to park there. The norm is not being able every day to see what God is doing. It's God not answering our prayers on our timeline. It's God not doing what you want him to do, or you expect him to do, or you thought he would do. And it's very easy, if you don't walk into your faith like accepting that, to ask the same question that the Israelites did when they were in the wilderness. Is the Lord really among us? You forget how God moved heaven and earth to save you. Right? That's Christ. That's the cross. And then when you do that, you also stop hoping for the promised land. And when you get there, here's what the wilderness takes over your heart. Your heart gets sunbaked out there in the wilderness, and you get comfortable in the wilderness, and then you settle for the wilderness, and then you settle in the wilderness, and that's how your heart grows hard toward God. That's why Hebrews 3:13, going back there, tells us to counsel each other. And that's to comfort and challenge, to warn and encourage each other. When? Every day. Why? So that we don't get hard-hearted. But then that raises the question, how can we do that? I mean, think about it. If we all need counseling every day, that means that we are all prone to harden our hearts before God and to let our hearts lead us away from God. And if we're all prone to it, how are we going to help each other? Right? We're just going to give each other stupid counsel. We need a counselor before we can counsel each other. We need a counselor in the wilderness. We need a counselor who's been through the wilderness but never settled for the wilderness. Who knows the way through the wilderness, who made it across without ever hardening his heart. And of course, that's who? That's Jesus. I mean, think about this. Isaiah 9, verse 6, right? You like to quote this around Christmas, and the names of Christ, right? When he's being... And we always skip to Prince of Peace. We have a song about him being the Prince of Peace. I have never heard a song about him being a wonderful counselor. But that's the very first thing. The reason that Jesus is a wonderful counselor, a wonderful counselor is Jesus my Lord, you could do it. You could pull that off, man. It's pretty much that song is really about, if you think about it. The reason Jesus is a wonderful counselor is because he made it through the wilderness without hardening his heart and without falling away from God. I mean, think about it. This is talking Jesus' temptations in where? The wilderness. He's there for 40 days. And Satan comes and he tempts him every which way, turn stones into bread. And people will be impressed by a Messiah who can do that. You don't have to die on a cross. If you can feed them, there's all kinds of stones out here in the wilderness. If you can feed all the hungry people, they'll just flock to you. Right? Those kind of temptations. And what did Jesus do every time talking out there in the wilderness? What did he say? Man shall not live on bread alone out here in this wilderness. See, when God created humans, when he created Adam and Eve, Adam is our representative, our first representative. They're in this beautiful garden, right? And they fail their temptation, and they end up getting exiled to a wilderness. Now Jesus meets Satan in the wilderness, and he succeeds, where they failed, where all of us fail. Why? So he can bring us back to Eden, back to the city of God. That's why. Listen to what Hebrews 4:15 said. We heard that this morning. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. A couple of reasons that this verse says that Jesus is our wonderful counselor. So a wonderful counselor first because he is able to sympathize with our weaknesses. He's experienced everything that we experienced. One major reason not to leave Christianity behind and go back into the world is that we are the only religion that I know of, at least, that claims that our God became one of us. Now, look, the Greek gods would take on human form all the time, but that's just so they could go carousing and be violent and wicked. I'm talking about our religion is the only one that claims that our God became one of us so that he could feel what it was like and he could experience what it was like to live in the limitations of human flesh. What? I could just shut up right now. I probably should. That should leave you in awe all week. That means Jesus knows what it's like to be rejected. He knows what it's like to be betrayed. He knows what it feels like to be lonely. He knows what loss and grief feel. How many times in the Bible is Jesus crying and sighing? He knows what hunger and thirst feel like. He knows what it's like to feel tears on your face, how it feels to be abused, how it feels to be tortured, how it feels to be humiliated. He knows what it means to feel weak and helpless. He even knows what it feels like to die. And because he's fully God as well as fully human, he knows what it is like to be you even better than you do because he created you. He sees both sides of it. Who better to be a counselor for us? Second, he's our wonderful counselor because he never sinned. Now, this is the part that used to bother me all the time because he'd be like, well, obviously that he never experienced everything I've experienced. Because if he never sinned, how does he know what it feels like to be a sinner? How does he know what it feels like to have to personally take responsibility for hurting someone or for making a mess out of everything because of poor choices you have made? I get that. He understood, he experienced the wrath of God for those things on the cross. He also experienced what the victims of those things go through. Both. That's how perfect justice was satisfied. But here's the other thing. Here's why that actually makes him a wonderful counselor, that he was tempted as we are, yet without sin. Sin, think about this. When Adam and Eve were in the garden and they sinned, what did they do? They hid. They start sowing fig leaves, and when God confronts them, what does Adam do? He blames his wife. This woman that you gave me, it's her fault. Sin does that to us. It separates us from each other. Right? Because where there is sin, there's that possibility that I can hurt you, I can violate you, I can manipulate you. What do we start doing? We start putting up walls, right? So we can't really be in good, healthy relationship with each other. Sin is what puts up walls, and it's also to hide our guilt and shame, as well as to protect ourselves from others who might have bad intentions. But Jesus does not have those barriers. Because he never sinned, he's able to offer us the gift of his open, honest, vulnerable self in a way that no other human has ever been able to. And in fact, here's the other deal. Y'all realize that in heaven right now, he didn't quit being human when he went back up there, right? He is the man, Jesus Christ. He's still one of us up there. In the days of his flesh, this is Hebrews 5, verse 7, in his earthly life, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death, and he was heard. He's still interceding for us as one of us now, incidentally, but this was in the Garden of Gethsemane, right? The night before he died. Also even on the cross as he died, right? Because he cries out, my God, why have you abandoned me? You know, he was in the wilderness spiritually in that time. Kind of exiled for us. We need a counselor. We need true, wise counsel. And you find that in the crucified, resurrected, and glorified Jesus. We need to be warned and encouraged. We need to be comforted and confronted. And the cross does that at once. The cross does both of those things at once. Confrontation and comfort intersect in the cross. Because, think about the vertical beam, right, that's pointing to heaven. Think about that as confronting us when you see Christ on it, confronting us with the absolute holiness and justice of God, as well as our own injustice and sin that did that to him. But then, of course, there's that horizontal beam that shows us God reaching out to embrace us and to comfort us, reaching out as one who has suffered with us. Now, in the days of his flesh, there in the garden, there on the cross, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications, what with loud cries and tears, to the one who was able to save him from death. Did God save him from death? Ultimately through resurrection, yes. But in that time when Christ was crying out for it, right, let this cup pass from me, did God save him from death? No. Does that mean that he was not heard? No, he was heard. Jesus shows us that even when we can't feel God or see God, right? Why have you abandoned me? God never abandoned him. Jesus had that experience that we have as sinners who don't see the presence of the Lord because of our sin. So even when we can't see God, we can't feel God, our prayers seem to be bouncing off the ceiling, what Jesus shows us is, in fact, God still hears us. God is still acting. Jesus must be our counselor before we can counsel each other. Because some of us, and you know who you are task-oriented, you are not patient, you do not have soft skills, you have really sucky bedside manners. You can confront people, you can challenge people, you can make an analysis of why things went wrong, you can complain about people, but here's what you cannot do. There's not a lot of grace in it, and that really can hurt people. The one who confronts us and challenges us, but does it with tears, is the only one who can soften your heart. Others of us, and we know who we are, we have a hard time confronting you, challenging you, because we really would like to comfort you. You know, we're like Jesus when he said, I'm like a mother hen who just wants to take you under my wings, my little chicks, you know. But Jesus shows us, too, how to confront through tears, because those tears and those sighs, what they do is they show your love. We got to get counseled by Jesus before we can counsel each other. In fact, stop trying to counsel. Maybe we should take a break from it just a little bit so we can get counsel from Jesus first. I don't know, man. Here's what I do know. Hebrews 4:16 says, because of all this, we can with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. This is the best news. The best news as we travel through the wilderness of life in this world, when we don't see God moving, at least not the way we want Him to, or as fast as we wish He would. Think about the ancient Israelites. They saw mighty miracles. They saw the 10 plagues. They crossed the Red Sea. And that did not make them not harden their hearts. They still hardened their hearts. And that led them away from God. But with Jesus, who is our wonderful counselor in the wilderness, we have something better. We have a resurrected human, one of us, sitting on the throne of grace at God the Father's right hand. Remember, Hebrews tells us that right at the beginning. He's collecting our prayers. He's gathering our prayers. He's praying with us. He's praying for us. The one who already made it through the wilderness and will return one day, right? He passed through the heavens to come to us, and he's going to pass through the heavens on his way, back with us. He will return to lead us home to the promised land, and that is why we can always approach God's throne with confidence, with our prayers every day, seeking wise counsel from Christ and the grace and mercy to counsel one another. Because of Him, because of Jesus, we know that we'll always be answered, even when it feels like our prayer just bounced right off the ceiling. Because Jesus is God's ultimate answer to our prayers, the ultimate fulfillment of all God's promises, and He is seated on the throne.